hopefully soon. Today we are starting our next unit. So we have finished up genetics, which is kind of the last of our very, very small look at biology, and we are going to take a very, very large look at biology with our study of natural selection. Yes, this is unit 7. Um, where's my clicker thing? There it is. So, today, the because natural selection is a kind of historic study, and we're going to take a kind of start to it with some historical context. Again, this is going to be a little bit wordy, but we are going to try our hardest not to write every word on the slides down. So feel free to summarize. I can help if that is necessary. But try not to write every single word down. Just get the important bits. And I can help with underlining and stuff like that. So, starting us off, what do you remember from your past studies of natural selection? Charles Darwin, yes, that's the guy. The yes, finches on Galapagos Islands. That was his main kind of study observation thing. Mutations, yes, mutations are one of the few ways that new variations enter populations. We'll talk a lot about that on Wednesday. Awesome. Survival of the fittest, yes. The term evolution didn't necessarily become attached to the idea of natural selection until much farther on. In fact, survival of the fittest wasn't even, or natural selection wasn't even the initial coined term of this idea. It was actually descent with modification, and that is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So, let's see if I can figure out how to. Nope, I'm gonna have to use the clicky thing. So, evolution as a whole is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. This isn't so. The way I was introduced to evolution in middle school, specifically the way schools teach evolution, is that this is not big E evolution, it is little e evolution. So, how populations change over time. It isn't necessarily an origin story, though it can provide evidence. It is also a scientific theory. So, a scientific theory is supported by testable explanations, but not held as fact. So, we were not around for all of geological time, right? We can't observe exactly what happened. Therefore, we do not know for sure um, that this theory is what happened. So, in this lecture, in the textbook, in most contexts of evolution through a or through a uh, high school and collegiate level, evolution and descent with modification are used interchangeably. So we, unless I'm just shortening something, the word evolution actually won't pop up a lot, especially in the context a lot of people think evolution is used in. So, changing in populations over time. That's what we're looking at. We will get into some specifics on Wednesday with population genetics. Um, but evolution is descent with modification. Any questions starting off? All right. So, we had some idea of what life was, or we had a hypothesis as to what evolution was, how species changed way before Charles Darwin came on the scene. right? We've normally think of Charles Darwin as the father of modern day genetics because he wrote the book on it. But there were ideas that kind of shaped the world that Darwin was brought into, ideas that Darwin was able to study and kind of work through to create his idea of the world. Starting off, Aristotle in ancient Greece concluded that life forms can be arranged on a ladder of increasing complexities. He called this scala naturae. We usually call them cladograms, right? If you remember anything like this, where like this is a common ancestor and these are branches off of uh, their like lineage, something like that, or like this. Um, those are called cladograms, and Aristotle had the idea that all of life could be contained in one big one. And Carolus Linnaeus took this a step further when he sought to classify life. So scientists like to make things organized, right? Scientists like to have name for things. We like to categorize things. Humans in general, right? We like to keep things in little boxes, and we don't really like it when the things leave those boxes, but they often do. So Carl Linnaeus, his main goal was to classify everything, and that is where we get binomial nomenclature. Now, binomial nomenclature sounds like a big long word, but you have interacted with this before. These are like our Greek names, right? Homo sapiens. I wish I knew more off the top of my head. But the two-letter like Greek names, Latin names that all species have is thanks to this guy Linnaeus. He came up with this idea that we should have a species name and a genus name, all as a way to kind of classify how organisms are related to each other based on evolutionary relationships. Any questions about this? All right, this is the world Charles Darwin was brought into. These were some of the ideas that were around when he came on the scene. Come on. There we go. So, one of the main reasons we had these ideas was because of fossils, right? Fossils have been found for a very long time, and those fossils are often found in sedimentary rocks. The awesome thing about sedimentary rocks is that they have visible layers. And those visible layers help us determine how old a fossil is, right? If two fossils are found in the same layer, we can infer that they were around at the same time. So, these layers are called strata, and they help us build a timeline. This is something we still use today. We still use layers in sediment to get an idea of when something was around. And as we were looking through these strata, we found that some species appeared in more than one level, and then they'd disappear, and then new species would appear, and then some species would disappear, and then new species would appear over time. So they've essentially recorded these mass extinctions and new species coming on the scene. And because these strata were kind of stark, there wasn't necessarily a gradient, some scientists hypothesize that all of these extinction and speciation events happened at catastrophic times, right? Or that something big and bad happened, a flood, an ice age, a meteor strike, something big, something bad happened, wiped everything out, and it started anew. While others looked at this same data and looked at the world around them and suggested that this happened in a slow, continuous process. The fossil record only provided snapshots. So even now, right, we have endangered species lists where we can kind of keep track of species that could go extinct soon or have gone extinct in the recent past, those events happened very, very slowly. It wasn't like, boom, we killed all of these animals, now there's none left. That happens sometimes. But a lot of times these extinction events are a lot slower. Organisms kind of fizzle out over time. So we now had two ideas of how evolution and new species came onto the scene, suddenly and all at once, or slowly and continuously. All of this just from paleontologists looking at fossil records. So, big long fossil record. Some looked at it and interpreted it as all at once. Some looked at it and interpreted it as slowly over time. That make sense? Cool, cool, cool. So, one last scientist before we get to Darwin, and that is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He published his hypothesis in 1809, which is coincidentally the year Charles Darwin was born. And I believe the year Abraham Lincoln was born. Just so you're set in time. I know it's kind of weird sometimes thinking about this stuff and then thinking about history and like how they coincide. But yeah, no, 1809, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck published his hypothesis comparing living species with fossil forms. So he looked at all of these fossils. He said, dang, these look a lot like some of the creatures we got around today. And he found what he saw as several lines of descent in a chronological series of older to younger fossils. So he said, okay, this is an armadillo, right? But 1,000 years ago, there was a fossil that looked kind of like an armadillo. And 1,000 years before that, there was something that looked a little less like an armadillo, but still kind of similar, and so on and so forth. So he was able to kind of see these series of fossils that led to current living species. And this idea led to his two principles. On the next slide. So, just by looking at fossil records and trying to make inferences about how these fossils compare to things that are around today, he came up with two ideas that were published probably as Charles Darwin was finishing up school or on his voyage on the HMS Beagle, which we will talk about today. This should be day Lamarck, but usually they drop the day anyway. So. All right. So Lamarck had two major principles. First is use and disuse. He noticed that parts of these bodies that are used excessively become larger and stronger, while those that are not deteriorate. So he thought that, okay, giraffes that use their necks more, eventually necks will get longer, right? Whereas, oh, if this organism doesn't need something, eventually it's not around anymore. Which we see in stuff like vestigial organs, i.e., the appendix and wisdom teeth. So he said that looking at this fossil record, that parts of the body that are used a lot become bigger and stronger, while those that are not used deteriorate. The second one is a very big through line. It is very, very important. It is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He inferred from these fossil records and from looking at everyday organisms that organisms can't pass modifications made in their lifetime to their offspring. So if a particular giraffe worked out very hard and had a very, very muscular neck because they worked really hard, it doesn't mean that their child will have a very, very muscular neck, right? If I go out and I go buy a box of red hair dye and I dye my hair red and then have a kid, that kid will not have red hair. We know this to have to do with DNA, right? That we can't pass stuff down to the next generation unless it's in our DNA. He didn't know a lot about DNA. He just looked at fossil records and looked at animals around his everyday life and figured this out kind of the back way. So he found his classification system. He organized the fossil records into certain lineages. He found that organisms that use certain characteristics more, those characteristics become larger and stronger. Ones that aren't used eventually go away. He also found that traits that an organism acquires over its life can't be passed down to the next generation. So if a tiger out in the forest loses a leg, right, their kids will still have 4 legs. Acquired characteristics can't be passed on. Which brings us to Charles Darwin. That guy in the hat right there was born on February 12th, 1809, and he studied at Cambridge University. Charles Darwin wasn't the best student. He had a very C's get degrees policy. Wasn't really his jam. He was a naturalist, a geologist, and a biologist, meaning he focused mainly in nature and how patterns exist in nature. He is known as the father of evolution. So a lot of people, including yourself, think evolution, think Charles Darwin. And finally, after college, some of his friends and family decided that while a little bit aimless in life, he would benefit from this 5-year boat trip to kind of figure out what he wants to do with his life. So he graduated from college, he hopped on a boat, and that boat sailed to South America. Pretty crazy looking beard, too. Now, of course, he did not look like this on the HMS Beagle. He was like 22, 23. But that's usually the image people get in their heads when they think Charles Darwin. So, what was the HMS Beagle like? It set sail in December 1831. And its primary mission was to chart poorly known stretches of the South American coastline, right? So it started up here in Europe, right? Went down to South America, around, hit up Australia, South Africa, and back up to England. So its primary mission, was to chart the shoreline to kind of help people navigate that in the future, make maps, all that fun stuff. Darwin, however, when he wasn't vomiting violently off the side of the boat, spent his time on shore collecting and observing plants and animals. One of the great ironies in scientific history is that Charles Darwin is best known for this boat trip, but he was violently seasick almost the entire time. He rarely ever left his little cabin while they were at sea. And when he did leave, it was when they were on shore, so he could immediately get off of the boat as fast as possible. So for Darwin, the name of the game was observe, was to sit on the boat and think and watch and record. So he would write down all of the fun variations and all of the different flora and fauna that he saw essentially across the southern hemisphere. Observing specimens and collecting what he could. Question? All right. So, his main focus, or one of the main things he observed in these trips, was adaptations. Adaptations are inherited characteristics. That inherited is our key phrase here and will continue to be a key phrase here. I will, as we get farther and farther into this, keep bringing genetics back into it. It won't be as technical as some of the stuff that we learned with gene regulation, but adaptations are inherited characteristics that help an organism survive and reproduce in specific environments. Specific environments is also a key phrase. Adaptations only work in the environment in which they are beneficial. Right? If a rabbit had an adaptation to help it evolve or help it run very, very fast on sand, and then we picked that rabbit up and we brought it to a grassy area, though that adaptation would no longer be beneficial, therefore no longer be an adaptation. So Darwin took his observations and focused very heavily on these adaptations, eventually coming to the conclusion that adaptations to environments and the origin of new species were very closely related. He said, okay, the idea that these inherited characteristics help organisms in their specific environments, that idea is very closely related to what I think the origin of new species is. That being able to adapt to your environment and change could lead to new species, especially if one species were split into two different environments and exposed to two different types of pressures. So if we took one of those bunnies, right, and we put one of them in a rocky environment and one of them in a grassy environment, eventually over lots and lots of time, if it was a population of rabbits in each, right, they could eventually get enough adaptations to no longer be considered the same species. And we'll talk about the process of speciation next week. So adaptations are inherited characteristics that help an organism survive in their specific environments. And Darwin said, hey, this idea really, really close to what I think the origin of new species is. So he came up with this idea of natural selection. Natural selection is the process in which individuals that have inherited traits, certain inherited traits, tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals because of those traits. He said, listen, if two organisms are in, or two groups of the same species exist in the same area, but one of them is a little bit faster, a little bit stronger, those organisms are going to survive longer and reproduce more because they have those little bit faster, little bit stronger genes. And then more of the population will have those little bit faster, little bit stronger genes until eventually they all do. Because those genes give them that edge. Natural selection is the process in which individuals that have certain traits that are beneficial, certain adaptations that are beneficial, specifically when it comes to survival and reproduction, will be better at surviving and reproducing because they have those traits. That's natural selection. Questions about that definition? Does it differ from anything you've learned in the past? All right. So that is natural selection. We got to natural selection from the idea of descent with modification. Descent with modification explains that the adaptations of these organisms and unifies life in general. Darwin never used the word evolution. He thought that descendants of an ancestral organism lived in a bunch of different habitats. And as they lived in all of these different habitats, they accumulated diverse, goodness gracious, modifications. So the idea of descent with modification takes natural selection to the next step and says, okay, if natural selection occurs, and natural selection occurs on the same species in a different environments, eventually they will have gradually accumulated a bunch of new and different characteristics. If we had if we had a species of fish, right? New species of fish that existed in open waters. And we took that species of fish and we cut the population in half and we put half of them in an area of the ocean with a lot of greenery, right? A lot of kelp, a lot of stuff like that. And we took the other population and we put it in a coral reef situation. Eventually, over time, because they have access to different types of food, they might adapt to be better at obtaining those different types of food. The ones in the kelp forest, if one of them has a slightly bigger mouth to get more greenery inside of it, right, then eventually over time, those organisms will kind of develop bigger mouths. If the ones in coral reefs, if the smaller ones got to eat more because they got to get in and out of all of those crevices, right, the smaller ones lived longer, the smaller ones reproduced more, those ones would get smaller over time. And that concept, that example, kind of covers what Charles Darwin thought as descent with modification. Questions here? All right. So, Charles Darwin realized that this probably wasn't going to be the most widely accepted idea. Even today, a lot of people hear the word evolution and immediately think everything about it is made up. Charles Darwin knew this, especially in the 1800s, and he thought of ways to kind of make this more palatable to the everyday person. Someone who didn't travel the entire world and make all of these observations and draw these connections. So we thought, hey, we do this all the time with plants and animals and crops. We do this all of the time. So he called this process artificial selection. Artificial selection is when humans modify species by selective breeding and taking desired traits and kind of breeding them into populations, right? Dogs. If there's a very, very, like if we want a big, well-natured dog, right? We might breed a big, bad dog and a medium-sized, good-natured dog and hope that that outcome is a large, good-natured dog, right? My stepmom's grandparents did this without even thinking. Every year, they're like 80 years old. Every year since like the 1970s, this old couple put together a huge garden in their backyard. Tomatoes, bell peppers, jalapenos, green beans, everything. And they would always have one row of corn so they can make popcorn. Every year they would pick all this corn, pop it all, and make caramel corn for everybody. We'd get like giant tubs of it at Christmas, and we didn't make it through it the entire year. But what they've been doing since the 70s is they would try different breeds of corn to see like different brands of seeds that they would buy every year. And every year they would keep track of which seeds they used and which seeds came out the best. And they would save some of the seeds from the best popcorn batches every year, and they would use those to plant the next year. And then they would take a couple seeds from the best batch that year and save them to plant next year. Over time, their popcorn got better and better and way more reliable. Without even knowing what the process of artificial selection is, they carried it out in their own backyard just because they wanted really good caramel corn. So Darwin said, listen, people have been doing this for eons, right? Since agriculture became a thing. Why can't nature do it too? And that kind of loosened the edges of the people of the world and helped his ideas get some traction. In addition to this, he had 2 observations and 2 inferences that kind of wrap up his entire idea as a whole. These were published in his book on the origin of species. I might have access to a copy. I'm gonna have to steal that, borrow that. His main observations was members of a population carry inherited traits. He said, yes, in a population, individuals have certain traits. He also said all species, no matter their environment, can produce more offspring than their environment to support. Meaning, at some point in time, a population of organisms is going to produce more babies than is possible for the environment to keep up. So many of this offspring are going to fail to survive and reproduce. Said, listen, it doesn't matter the species, it doesn't matter the environment. Some members of a population aren't going to reproduce and aren't going to survive. That's just the way nature works. So he said, inherited traits are passed from generation to generation, and species are always going to make more babies than can survive in a population. Those were his 2 observations. Inherited traits, species are going to make more babies than they can take care of. From these 2 observations, he drew 2 inferences, things that he thought were true or inferred from the fact that these were the observations he made. These 2 inferences, a little bit wordy, but individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving. So individuals with traits that are good for the environment tends to leave more offspring than other individuals. He said, well, if traits are inherited and organisms are going to make more babies than possible, it would make sense that the babies with the better traits are going to live longer and make more babies. Individuals with good traits that give them a higher likelihood of surviving and reproducing are going to leave more offspring than others. If an organism in the environment is more adapted to reproduce, if it has if it's like a bird, right, that has a mating ritual that has to do with some sort of dance or call or feather pattern, right? The organisms with the bigger, better, brighter dances and patterns are going to reproduce more because they're better at reproducing. And he took that idea and he took his observations and he said, well, if abilities and traits and characteristics are unequal, if there are some organisms that are better fit to their environment than others, it will lead to the accumulation of those favorable traits. Over time, those traits are going to be more popular because we will have more babies with these traits. And then those babies will have more babies with those traits. And then those babies will have even more babies with those traits until the entire or almost the entire population has those really good characteristics that make them better at surviving and reproducing. Questions about Darwin's observations or inferences? So there are, to wrap this up, these are our three key features of natural selection. So if you don't take anything from today, this is what you need. Number one is the definition of natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which individuals that have certain heritable traits survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals because of those traits. Those traits are what make those organisms better at surviving and reproducing. Number one. Number two, over time, natural selection increases the frequency of adaptations that are favorable, increasing the frequency of favorable adaptations. That idea, the frequency of certain traits in environment, is what we are going to spend all day Wednesday and Thursday talking about. Calculating frequencies of alleles in populations because the environment has an effect on them. Number three, if an environment changes, or if a population, individuals, move to a new environment, natural selection may result in adaptations to these new conditions. Meaning, if a population was picked up and brought to a new place, we would have different individuals that are better at surviving and reproducing. Therefore, natural selection would choose those traits instead of the ones from their old population or environment. Sometimes this selection is intense enough to start an entire new species or transform an old species into a new species. That process is called speciation. So overall, natural selection is a process that in certain inherited traits that lead to better survival and reproduction lead to higher rates, or those individuals survive and reproduce better because they have those traits. Over time, this natural selection will increase the frequency of these favorable traits. And that if the environment changes, natural selection will change along with it. If an organism lives in a forest that is lush and green and they develop camouflage to be lush and green and they are picked up and brought to a more orange environment, right? The more orangey greens are going to survive longer until eventually, over time, we will develop some sort of orange camouflage or some other characteristic to evade predators. This process could lead to a new species overall. Any questions about this? Tomorrow, we are going to talk about evidence for evolution beyond what Darwin said, what we can see with our advanced analysis of fossil records and simulations, models, and all that fun stuff. that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. We'll probably have a little activity to go along with it, just so I'm not talking all day. Yes. And then I believe Wednesday brings us into population genetics, which is a lot of fun. And we'll, I believe, finish out the week with population genetics.